Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Climate and Energy with the National Security Council, Michelle Patron, Senior Director of Sustainability Policy at Microsoft, and Foreign Policy's Allison Carlson for a discussion on reaching net zero emissions.
Good morning, everyone. In the room and online, thank you for joining us. We're really excited to have you here and also to get to build on the discussion that was just had. It's pretty clear based on, IEA's stock take and what we're seeing in the energy landscape right now that we absolutely need to accelerate the transition to clean energy in order to come close to meeting our sustainability goals and the goals for meeting net zero by mid-century. And this conversation is about how can we really operationalize the commitments that have been made and the ambition that we have to move the dial forward, especially in an environment where we are seeing increasing energy demand around the world with a strong industrial base, and also data centers, especially where there is such a demand, an increasing demand for energy. And so we have a tremendous amount of expertise on this stage from different sectors. And Jake, I'd love to start with you to build off the conversation that was just had with Ali Zaidi. And, even part of the Biden-Harris administration was made what some people refer to as once-in-a-generation investments in clean energy and infrastructure. And I'd love to hear from you how you and the transition team have been thinking about that as a part of a broader industrial strategy and what your priorities are to ensure that those ambitions and commitments are actually moving forward.
Sure. Well, thanks for the warm intro, and it's nice to be here with former colleagues and current colleagues in this climate and energy space, and nice to be at an FP event where Ali Zaidi doesn't get booed off the stage. So that's a win. I think I love your question. I should say this is the 5th week that I'm in my new role at the National Security Council, having come from the Development Finance Corporation, and bringing a finance lens into what we're doing, and sort of trying to situate that within the broader conversation of industrial strategy, geopolitical challenges, transnational challenges, has been sort of an interesting education, particularly a bit of a history lesson, because if you think about my new boss, Jake Sullivan, likes to sort of talk about how in the Cold War era, we were sort of living in a world defined by geopolitical tension and competition. After the Cold War, we had several decades where we were able to focus on transnational challenges. And today we've entered a world where you've layered geopolitical competition back onto transnational challenges. And to me, it sort of feels like that part of Super Mario Brothers, where you get to the last level and then the boss comes and you've got to, defeat the boss again. You think you've figured it out. I think, the addition of AI and data centers feels like another sort of unexpected layer of how to manage all of this risk. But, the fundamental reality that I think we're all coming to terms with is that for a long time, we understood that markets would sort of do their thing. They would take care of externalities. They would provide growth. And I think we underestimated that as much as we could optimize for efficiency, we were maybe sacrificing or vulnerable in the area of resilience. We were sacrificing or vulnerable in the area of sustainability. And look no further than the COVID pandemic to understand how that played out in terms of basic supply chains for PPE, for healthcare equipment, for vaccines. Look no further than the current war in Ukraine to see how that played out for Europe and is playing out for Europe in terms of the weaponization of energy resources and what risks can arise when you are singularly dependent on one supply chain. And I think that the piece of Ali's talk that I want to bring into this answer, because it is relevant for how we think about the foreign policy of this administration and the approach overseas with our partners, is that as much as we want to accelerate the clean energy transition, and as much as we're doing that, and you heard some of the record numbers, in terms of manufacturing brought online, almost $900 billion of investments in manufacturing in America, 580 new facilities for clean energy development, 300,000 new jobs. As much as we accelerate that, you cannot accelerate that in a democratic system without bringing communities along. Because if you lose the political economy for the clean energy transition, then you will have a backlash, it will slow down, it will stop. And I think we've seen sort of zigs and zags of that over the last 4 years. And one of the things that is so critical to this industrial strategy is that it is designed to respond to local needs for jobs, for transition, for equity, so that we can continue pushing forward with a supply chain and a manufacturing base that is more resilient, more sustainable, less reliant on others, and can balance around efficiency and resilience and some of these underlying goals.
Yeah, we think quite a bit about those geopolitics here at Foreign Policy, and I'm grateful that you brought that in and recognition of the world that we're living in and the shifting dynamics, and as they relate to international markets as well. We're also seeing a fragmentation that potentially could undermine the ability to scale projects, align policies, regulatory initiatives, and make it difficult to scale and deploy projects in different markets, not to mention the supply chain issues that you referenced. Avik, I'd like to bring you in. From Capital Power's perspective, you're expanding portfolios in Canada, in the US, and operating internationally. I'd love to pick up on that and hear reflections that you have on Jake's comments, but I'd love to hear also how you're thinking about navigating your commitment to reducing emissions, which are ambitious within your own company, and also how you're doing that with various generation assets, and how you're prioritizing knowing that you need to reduce emissions in your portfolio, meet increasing energy demand, and also do so in a way that's sustainable, affordable, and reliable. How are you thinking about that challenge?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think first we have to start with the acknowledgement that the world has changed, just as you identified. For 20 years, we could have been having this conversation around energy transition, and it was all predicated on decarbonizing our electricity stack. It was taking out high-emitting fossil fuels generation, replacing with renewables. But it was based on a century's worth of build-out of infrastructure. And if we had any economist in the room over the last 20 years, we would have said, the economic growth and power generation demand was largely decoupled in the US because we had built out all of this infrastructure post-World War II over 50 years, and it worked and served our needs. But what we hadn't predicted is that electricity demand growth would fundamentally and in a secular way change. And it's not just because of data centers. It's reshoring. It's continued electrification. It's what we're continuing to see on EVs, as was mentioned before. Even though the stock prices don't indicate it, EV growth is still on trajectory to change the world. And it's now also economic growth. So in fact, we've actually moved from what was focused on energy transition, replacing the stack, to today we're actually now looking at energy expansion. So now we've added another layer to it, which is not only do we need to change the stack and decarbonize, reduce greenhouse gas intensity on that existing infrastructure, but we've now got to serve growing load. And, as we look past the last 15 years in particular, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for companies like Microsoft and the tech companies. 2/3 of renewable PPAs were funded by our tech companies. And that's what's taken us to almost 15% of the renewable slate. So we are a company that today is 80% natural gas, 20% renewables and batteries. But we are exceptionally proud of that. We haven't run from that. Why? 10 years ago, we were 80% coal. And instead of shrinking and instead of retiring coal, we've repowered coal. And today we're zero coal. So our intensity is less, but our stack is still fossil fuel. But what we found through 10 years of working in multiple electricity markets in North America is, in fact, you need reliable dispatchable power generation. And the more renewables you have, the more reliability you need to maintain grid reliability. So we've taken a position that we have to address reliability, affordability, and clean. And we have to do it from a system perspective and understand what grid reliability is required. And for us as a power producer, I think the big thing that's changed over the last few years as we're looking at load growth is it's no longer a bilateral. It's no longer a question of us as a generator working with a counterparty that needs power. It's a multi-stakeholder engagement that's required. You need to work with utilities. You need to work with ISOs. You need to work with off-takers. You need to manage physical power, but you have to manage credits and you have to manage clean. And so that's where we're focusing. While we're trying to focus on bringing things like carbon capture and sequestration in, we're exploring, SMRs for that medium to longer term solution on baseload.
Thank you for the way that you laid that out, and also talking about the evolution of the sector and also the need for a portfolio approach that will actually enable that transition and hasten that transition. And I think you set Michelle up well. I'd like to turn to you in that regard, with Microsoft also being at the forefront of this transition in many ways, as Avik mentioned, with those kinds of partnerships. And Microsoft has its own ambitious sustainability goals, including being net zero by 2030, which is rather soon. And so I'd love to hear from you. I know you've had quite a great deal of experience in policy as well, and now working in the context of Microsoft. How are you seeing the policy environment being able to facilitate this transition, and how are you thinking about that now in your role at Microsoft, and what's needed to really move the dial to be able to generate additional electrons?
Well, thank you, and it really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Foreign Policy, for convening and for all of the great work you do on this issue. What I'd like to do a little bit is talk first about Microsoft's journey and what we've learned, and how the levers that we use to achieve our goals, and then touch briefly on the opportunities and challenges that we face on AI and energy. So, Microsoft, we are a global company with a global footprint, and we have embedded our sustainability targets in the way that we operate, in the way that we build out infrastructure, and the way that we work with our suppliers. So 4 years ago, we set a bold North Star to be carbon negative, water positive, waste zero, and to protect as much land as we use. And 4 years into that journey, we've made a lot of progress on our own operations, where we see the biggest challenge is on working with our supply chain. In terms of we see three important levers that we use in achieving our goals. One is our procurement lever, for us to be able to really help develop the markets, if it's for the carbon-free electricity that we need to power our infrastructure in order to hit our 100% carbon-free electricity goal by next year. If it is the work that we're doing to help create the sustainable aviation fuel that is needed to help bring down the emissions in our travel. If it is the markets for green steel and green cement that we need to be able to bring low carbon building materials into our data centers. So we see that a really important role, and hope we're going to talk about a few more examples of how we are using that procurement to really help bring forward these new markets. The second is as an innovator and investor, and we have a $1 billion climate innovation fund, which we are like about 3/4 of the way deployed right now. We've invested in over 50 companies that are developing these technologies. If it's the green steel, if it's direct air capture, long duration storage, grid enhancing technologies to be able to put more electrons on the existing grid that we have, to be able to help create the solutions that Microsoft and other companies can buy. And then the third lever is in policy. And policy has an important role to play in scaling these markets and in helping creating the infrastructure for us to be able to deliver, if it's the growing carbon-free electricity that we need, whether it's in transmission planning, in permitting reform, and helping to create the conditions to really bring forward this next generation of technologies. There's been a lot of talk about AI and energy this morning, as well as this entire week. And it's important to understand that when we talk about low demand, it's AI energy is happening at the same time that we are seeing so many other drivers of electricity demand. If it's electrification, if it's industrial heat, if it's reshoring of manufacturing, and we all need to work together to be able to address it. We know that energy demand from data centers and AI is growing, but it's important to put it in context, right? That electricity demand right now from AI and data centers is about 2 to 4% globally, including in the United States. The other thing that we know is over the last more than decade, we've seen a 9 times increase in the amount of compute that's used from the same electricity. So there's been tremendous efficiency gains that happen inside the data center, and companies are continuing to work on that to help really manage this growth. The other way that we are doing this and how we purchase carbon-free electricity, I think that it's sometimes this week I found that there's like a lot of surprise to really understand the scale of the purchasing that the companies like Microsoft do. To date, we have 34 gigawatts of solar, wind, and other renewables that we've contracted in over 24 countries and 150 projects. These are new projects that we've built and brought onto the grid. And we are also looking at ways we can use our purchasing power to bring forward the next generation of carbon-free projects, whether it's fusion, advanced nuclear, existing nuclear, geothermal storage, because we're going to need all the tools in the toolbox to be able to meet demand. The last thing I'd say before I hand it back over is just the opportunities that we see in AI to be able to really accelerate the energy transition. Let me just give you 2 quick examples. One is using AI to actually put more electrons on the current grid. We're investing in a company called Line Vision, which looks at the transmission grid and sees where there are opportunities to send more electricity. In the UK, National Grid has deployed this, and they've been able to free up over space to bring online a new 600 megawatt offshore wind project, so without having to build out the grid. So that's a really exciting opportunity that's going to enable us really, today to be able to expand the capacity. The second is the ability to make breakthroughs in scientific discovery. Earlier this year, Microsoft partnered with one of the Department of Energy labs, the Pacific National Northwest, to be able to use generative AI and high-performing computers to help find a new solution, a new battery materials that will reduce lithium by 70%. We looked at 32 million potential combinations and whittled it down to just a dozen. What would have taken years in a lab took 80 hours. So the promise that this has to be able to help us use our existing infrastructure more efficiently, to be able to create new solutions, to be able to really speed up this transition is really exciting, and we need to balance both in order to be able to achieve our goals.
Great. And that efficiency in production and ability to expand that renewable capacity or zero emission capacity, low emission capacity is incredibly important, especially as demand is obviously going to absorb quite a bit of that lower emission energy, and the need to expand that capacity is real, but also requiring the portfolio approach of other sources as well. in order to meet that growing demand curve. And Jake, I'd like to turn to you when you're thinking about this portfolio approach and, with the energy transition team, how are you thinking about that as it relates to the need for natural gas, the need for lower emission sources as we're building out that renewable capacity, and especially as it relates to baseload, right? And we aren't quite there yet with utility scale storage, at the level that's needed in any case. And so how are you thinking about that portfolio approach and how we can prioritize that to really facilitate the transition and how to square that circle in terms of our ambition?
Well, I think, we think about it over a time horizon, but there are things that I'm worried about, candidly. I think, even as Michelle sort of rightly pointed out, some of the gains and the opportunities that this new technology and capability can provide, and these are super exciting and in many ways, could sort of help address the fundamental issue that we're talking about, which is a massively daunting task in terms of increased demand for electricity consumption. I met anecdotally earlier this week with folks who are working on fusion. They were explaining to me sort of a similar dynamic that, we have now been able to take supercomputing power, AI power, to accelerate the number of essentially experiments that we can do in the lab. And that has condensed the timeframes for deployment of certain fusion technologies that are now making their way into demonstration project and commercial project planning. And that is potentially a game changer. But I worry at the same time that as that comes online, we don't yet have enough information about what the future demand curve will look like as a result of AI data centers to really be able to understand how we need to be planning. And I think the industry should be concerned about what is happening in the discussion at the state level, where you have legislatures and regulators who are seeking to put a pause on this type of growth, who are looking for time to understand that. And so I think we need to build out a little bit of space to really understand what it is exactly that we're talking about. Michelle and I were talking backstage and both coming at this with different data sets of what does the growth curve look like, what does the track record look like to inform that. And there are real world consequences to this as well. If you are General Electric or Siemens and you're selling combined cycle turbines and you want to be helpful to the effort to replace the more than 9 gigawatts of electric generating capacity that has been destroyed via missile and drone by Russia in Ukraine in the last 6 months, you are now more likely to search for a buyer in the shape of a data center in the United States than in the form of the grid operator in Ukraine. And obviously, we get back to the conversation on markets and fragmentation. General Electric and Siemens should sell into the market that they wish to sell into. But when you suddenly have a demand pull for new gas generation, not only does it create challenges in terms of the transition that you're referring to from a climate perspective, but it also creates challenges in terms of where we were thinking about potentially allocating that resource on an emergency basis. That says nothing at all of the demand that we know exists and is really important in places like Sierra Leone, like Mozambique, sub-Saharan African countries, Southeast Asian countries that are working to build renewable energy into the grid. They're working to create battery storage. They need the base load in order to be able to integrate that. And so when you dry up the market for that type of base load generating capacity due to demand for one thing, it has consequences in other places. The last thing that I just note on this, because I know we're running short on time, is I think we see an enormous opportunity, and I think that we have all been a little bit we haven't been focused enough together in this community on the role and the the promise of nuclear power in this regard. And when you look at levelized cost of electricity and you consider nuclear plus renewable energy, it is competitive. Now, I'm not arguing that nuclear on its own from a levelized cost of energy is competitive, but when you look at it from a systems perspective, the analysis suggests that it's competitive with market pricing for fossil baseload plus renewable energy, energy storage plus renewables. And I think that needs to be a big part of the conversation. I think it's super exciting that Microsoft has recently become, or signaled that it would become, an off-taker to repower the nuclear capacity that was decommissioned in Pennsylvania for their purpose. But obviously there's an enormous opportunity across the board in all these other areas of growth: electric vehicles, charging stations, American manufacturing, and so on. And I think that that has to be a key part of the solution if we're going to adhere to the IEA's very helpful report, if we're going to start actually planning a transition away from fossil fuels as the IEA recommended, and if we're going to think about how we distribute resources not only to developed economies like the United States, but to emerging markets all over the world that are desperate for this type of baseload capacity.
Absolutely, and we do need to talk a little bit more about advanced nuclear and systems integration, and don't worry, we will. So you should all stick around because we're actually having a conversation related to that later this morning. So thank you for raising that, and I think you're absolutely on point with that. And I'd love to hear, Avik, from you, and we are running up on time, but from an industry perspective, when you're thinking about these challenges that we've all been discussing on stage, operating in different markets at states and local levels, and very importantly, needing to bring communities along, thinking about co-location and what is appropriate and what is feasible within different markets. How are you approaching that as you expand your portfolio and doing it in a strategic and efficient way?
It's a great question. Look, if we look at this, fundamentally, it's a macro challenge, but it's a micro problem. The macro challenge is climate. The micro problem is reliability and affordability, which means at a local level, we need to figure out, most of us in this room, if any of us look at our utility bill, 2/3 of that cost is not generation, it's rate base. It's all of the infrastructure costs required to get power to our homes and to our businesses. And so the micro problem is, how do we increase reliability of the grids, and how do we decrease or increase affordability but lower cost? And so things like the Microsoft transaction, which is working in partnership, not just with a bilateral off-taker, it's finding those solutions. So where we're focused as a company, because we operate in multiple jurisdictions, is how do you meet the needs? And I agree, Michelle, it's not a data center issue. It's a load growth issue overall. So 1,000 megawatts. So everyone talks about the 1,000 megawatt data center, but it could be an agriculture, a fertilizer plant. It could be an industrial plant. That 1,000 megawatt power center is the equivalent of providing enough electricity for 500,000 to 1 million homes. It's huge demand. And so what we're doing is saying, okay, how do we provide 500, 700 megawatts today through reliable power without compromising reliability, but also meet the needs of the grid over time, and helping in the overall planning for building new reliable capacity over time. And then bringing in products to increase clean electricity into it. So where can you marry that with renewable projects that do have interconnects? How do you marry that with carbon offsets, whether it's voluntary and compliance? And what we're really focusing on is, at a local level, trying to build bundled solutions. I think gone are the days you can be a renewable player and not care about reliability and affordability. I think gone are days you can be a utility or a thermal provider like us and not care about clean and not care about working with stakeholders. So it has to be all of the above. And maybe one last final point, Article 6, Article 6, Article 6. right? We need carbon taxonomy because we need to put a price on carbon so we can scale and build real infrastructure.
Way to bring us home. Thank you for that. And for all of your expertise and your work on these issues. We really appreciate it. Avik Day, Michelle Patron, and Jake Levine. Nice to see you.